Hello student, this is your review for the exam on Unit 2, Texas Government. Okay. The principles and positions supported by a political party generally referred to as the party platform, which is often written out in a document and adopted by the convention of the party. Tip O'Neill was a famous Speaker of the House he was from Massachusetts, and he said, all politics are local. He was talking about the fact that local issues often determine the politics that migrate up to the national level. Okay, the process of political socialization is a process by which individuals develop their ideas and their values and their party affiliation and so forth. It's called political socialization. The movement in Texas that has had a large impact on the state legislature has been called the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party is not an official party. It's sort of a philosophy within the Republican Party, which is a very conservative wing of the party. They're referred to as the Tea Party people. Okay, the most important way that parties help voters make decisions during the election is to give voters a party label they can identify with when deciding how to vote. In other words, when you go to vote, very often you don't know all the candidates on the election, and you're confused. But if it's a partisan election where candidates are identified as Republican, Democrat, Green Party, Libertarian, Independent, whatever they may be, then that kind of gives you a sort of a guideline as to how to cast your vote. Because if you feel that you're primarily a Democrat, then you would vote for Democratic candidates, even though you might not know too much about each one of them. Or you might consider yourself a Republican, so you would tend to vote for the Republican candidate, even though you might not know much about that candidate. You would sort of trust the fact that he or she bears a party label that you also identify with. Okay, the process by which parties get divided from one end of the spectrum to the other is called political polarization. In other words, it's like they move toward the extreme ends of the spectrum of politics. That Democrats become very liberal, Republicans become very conservative, and there's not a lot of moderates left. And that's called political polarization. Okay, there is a tension within the Republican Party between the pro-business type Republicans, like the George Bushes, for example, as opposed to the social conservatives who are mainly interested in things like immigration policy. They are opposed to expansion of immigration. They're in favor of limiting immigration, abortion, things of that nature. There's a tension within the Republican Party in that regard. The pro-business Republicans are primarily interested in legislation and government policies that benefit business. Okay, first past the post is in an electoral system is like a winner take all. There is no runoff, as whoever gets the plurality of the votes. That's what we have in the general elections in Texas. When we get to in the party primaries, the Republican Democratic primaries, a candidate for that party in each position that's going to be up for election will be chosen by a majority. It has to be a majority. So if in one of the parties there are several candidates and nobody gets a majority on first election day, then there has to be a runoff election to choose the candidate who's going to represent the party in the general election. But when you get to the general election in November, it's plurality, as whoever's got the most votes. In fact, there was a situation in 2006 where there were 4 major candidates for governor. There was the incumbent Rick Perry, who was running as for re-election as a Republican. You had Chris Bell, who was the Democratic nominee, and you had 2 independents. One of them was a former Republican and state comptroller named Carolyn Rylander Strayhorn, and the other one was a guy named Kinky Friedman. And so when the votes were cast, Rick Perry got 39% of the votes, Chris Bell got 29%, and Carolyn Rylander, who ran under the slogan of "I'm a tough old grandma," he said, "Well, I'm a tough old grandma. I can run the state of Texas." She got 19% of the vote, and then Kinky Friedman, whose campaign slogan was "Why the hell not?" and he had some controversial campaign promises like legalizing marijuana, for example. And he got 12% of the vote. But Rick Perry won the election with only 39% of the vote. There was no runoff because it was just a first past the post. It was just required a plurality. Okay. What do you have to do to become a member of the Democratic or Republican Party? Nothing. Just show up at the next meeting. There's no requirements. You just have to be a registered voter, and there is no party registration in Texas. You can't say, "I'm a registered Republican" or a registered Democrat. Most states do have that. They do require you to identify your political preference, your party preference, when you sign up to vote. Texas does not do that. However, when the time for the primary elections comes around in the spring of even-numbered years, then you have to make a decision which primary you're going to vote in. Are you going to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, or are you going to go to the convention for the Green Party or the Libertarian Party? They don't have primaries because they really don't have enough following to justify the cost of doing that. So you have to make a decision at that time, and if you decide to vote in, say, the Democratic primary, then when you go into the voting booth, every candidate on the ballot is a Democrat. You have to choose which Democrat you want in each race to be the representative of the Democratic Party in the general election in the following November. So I say that Texas has sort of a hybrid system where you don't choose your party when you register, but you do have to choose it when you decide to vote in a presidential or in a party primary. Okay, the States Rights Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, they split with the National Democratic Party in 1948 over the question of racial integration. They actually ran a candidate for president who carried a few states, and that was Strom Thurmond. He carried a few southern states, and in fact, in the 1948 presidential election, the incumbent was President Harry Truman, the Democrat. There was the Republican candidate was a guy named Thomas Dewey, and then you had Strom Thurmond running as a independent, as the representative of the States Rights Party, and everyone predicted that Dewey would win because, hey, the Democratic Party split, so the Republicans going to win. Didn't happen. Truman won re-election, and there was a well-known guy named Jimmy the Greek who made heavy bets on Truman to win, and he won a lot of money at that time. one of the key functions of the county executive committee. Each party has a executive committee. There's a representative from every precinct in the county, and there's a Democratic executive committee and a Republican executive committee, and they're the ones who have to canvass the votes and decide who won the party primaries. And they run the primary elections, and for the most part they pay for them. The county handles the administration, but the parties have to pay for the printing of the ballots and so forth. The county chair of the Democratic Party is elected by the voters in the party primary, and same thing for the Republican. But the state party convention chooses the state chairman of the party when they have their convention. And the state party has a state executive committee, which is made up of representatives from all over the state, and they are in charge of fundraising for the party and also establishing the party's policies. Presidential republicanism is described as the situation where a person votes for the Republican candidate for president, but votes for conservative Democrats for state offices. And that was the situation in Texas for a couple of decades, starting with Eisenhower in the 1950s and going on to the present day. In the post-Civil War era, only parts of Texas that showed significant Republican leanings were the German counties. There's out not far from here, west of Houston, there are German counties, like where cities like New Braunfels are located with heavy German population, and they tended to affiliate with the Republican Party. Conservative Democrats are also known as Blue Dog Democrats. Between 2008 and 2018, countywide elections in Harris County were swept by Democrats. And a lot of that had to do with straight ticket voting, because people could go into the booth and pull one lever and vote for all the members, all the candidates from a particular party. And the Republican officials, analyze the results of the elections, and they say, hey, if we didn't have straight ticket voting, probably some of our Republican judges would have won, because Democrats tended to like to do the straight ticket voting. And so straight ticket was abolished by the legislature in 2015, and it went into effect with the election in 2016. So you cannot vote straight ticket. You can vote straight ticket, but you got to go down and mark each race individually. Okay, by focusing on influencing the Republican primary elections, the Tea Party movement in Texas is trying to get Tea Party supported candidates on the ballot, but under the Republican Party label. See, it's difficult for a third party or for an independent candidate to get on the ballot. You have to circulate petitions and get many thousands of signatures, and it's a lot of trouble to get on the ballot as an independent candidate or as a third party candidate. So it's easier to just fold your supporters into one of the two major parties and try to get your candidates elected under that party label. Texas voters often use party affiliations of the candidates as a way to make voting decisions. Yes, because particularly in Harris County, you go in to vote, particularly in a primary election, but of course that's all one party. But even in the general election, there are so many candidates on the ballot because we have so many judges running for election or re-election in Harris County it's impossible to know all the candidates. So you just say, well, I feel like I'm primarily a Republican, so I'll vote for all the Republicans, or I'm primarily a Democrat, I'll vote for all the Democrats, or Green Party, or whatever, Libertarian. Texas requires people to designate party affiliation when registering to vote. No, that is false. You do not say when you register to vote, you just register to vote. You don't have to say I'm registering as a Democrat or as a Republican or as an independent. And as I said, most states require that, but not Texas. Okay, and sometimes you have third-party candidates that emerge, like I mentioned in 2006, with Kinky Friedman and Carolyn Strayhorn, Rylander Strayhorn, but they are usually unsuccessful. Even nationwide third-party candidates are unsuccessful. The Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond in 1948, opposed the civil rights and pro-integration policies of President Harry S. Truman. Yes, that's true. Why are statewide officials like governor and lieutenant governor and so forth elected in non-presidential years? Because you would think that, well, in presidential years, there's a higher turnout of voters because the presidential election, attracts a lot of attention. And so you'd say, hey, the turnout's going to be more in presidential years. So why doesn't Texas elect its top officials like the governor and lieutenant governor in presidential years? Why don't they do that? Why did they elect them in non-presidential years? Well, simply because they want state issues to be predominant when you are voting for a governor or a lieutenant governor. They don't want it to be mixed in with national issues which emerge in a presidential election. Social media has become a very effective fundraising tool, and some candidates that start out with not too much name recognition ultimately get a lot of name recognition and raise a lot of money through social media. The prime example that I can think of is Bernie Sanders, who started out, when he first ran in 2016, nobody knew who he was, but he went to social media and he did fundraising and he raised a lot of money in very small donations. He didn't accept money from what's called PACs, political action committees. He relied upon small donations from people giving $15, $20, $25, and he raised a lot of money through social media. Bill Clinton did the same thing. Also, Obama did that. Okay, during the 19th and 20th century, Texas was not a competitive two-party state. It was a Democratic state. Although within the Democratic Party then, just as it is today, there is a wide spectrum of political philosophies. There are conservatives, there are moderates, there are liberals, there are socialists in the Democratic Party, both statewide and national. So they're frequently fighting with each other for power, to get their philosophy to be the one that the party goes with. Okay, but it was the solid South in the 18th and 1800s and 1900s, all the way up until the Eisenhower election. Texas was not a two-party state. African Americans tend to vote at higher rates than other ethnic groups in Texas. Yes, African Americans have a good turnout rate. Because of the process of political socialization, most people tend to have the same political affiliation as their parents, but not always. Sometimes young people, as you well know, rebel against their parents, and they will do exactly the opposite of what their parents want them to do. We know that happens. But for the most part, the children will, having been raised in the household with their parents, will tend to have the same political affiliation as their parents. Okay, when deciding how to vote, people will sometimes use mental shortcuts, and they're called, political scientists call that cues. Like they say, well, in other words, they'll focus maybe on one issue, like abortion or immigration or environmental issues or abortion or what have you. They'll focus on one thing, and they'll tend to vote, well, whoever's for this, I'm for, or whoever's against this, I'm for, whatever. That's called cues. They call them cues, political scientists. Okay, we vote in general elections to elect members of Congress. These are called the off-year elections. The members of Congress are elected every 2 years. The president's only elected every 4 years. So there's one time when members of Congress are up for re-election when there's not a presidential election going on. So that's in the even-numbered years. You have every member of Congress, the U.S. Congress, every member of the U.S. Congress, and every member of the Texas House of Representatives are up for re-election. If they want to keep their jobs, they have to get re-elected. And that is every even-numbered years, and it is the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. And so it's usually on November the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Okay. In Texas, special elections are called to ratify amendments to the Texas Constitution. Special elections are also called to fill a vacancy because some member of the legislature resigned or died or something, and so they have a special election to fill that seat. Okay, women's suffrage was the establishment of the right of women to vote in all elections with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. You remember I mentioned that Governor James Ferguson, also known as Jim Ferguson, was impeached and removed from office, and his lieutenant governor became governor then, and William Hobby, and the first thing that he did was call a special election of the legislature, or special session of the legislature to consider the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which Texas did ratify it. Texas was the first southern state to ratify it, and it was the 5th state overall nationwide to ratify it. So Texas moved very quickly on that, thanks to the leadership of Governor William Hobby. The poll tax was made illegal in federal elections with the passage of the 24th Amendment. And of course, since it was illegal in federal elections, it also obviously has to be illegal in all elections. So everyone can vote without paying, or register to vote without paying a fee. Used to be you had to pay money in order to just register to vote. You had to pay money. And when I was registering people to vote when I was in college in the 1960s, I registered people to vote. I was a deputy registrar, and the fee was $1.50. You had to pay $1.50 to register to vote. Well, $1.50 is not much today, but in the 1960s, it was a lot of money. It would buy you a Coke, fries, and a Coke. A burger, fries, and a Coke you could get for $1.50. There's a group called the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDA, and they monitor changes in the electoral law that may suppress the votes of minorities. They're watchdogs, so to speak. Okay. At one time, there was an offshoot of the Democratic Party called the Jaybird Party. because Democrats were running a white-only party, even though African Americans have been accorded the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. Still, the Democrat Party was saying, okay, it's our party, we can do what we want, so we're just going to let white folks vote. And that was brought to court, and of course the court said, no, you can't do that. And so the fraction of the Democratic Party set up another party called the Jaybird Party, which they said, well, we're not the Democrat Party, we're just a private group, and so if we want to just let white folks vote, we can. And so their idea was to elect candidates for various offices and then plug them into the Democratic primary as the Democratic candidate. And so there would only be one candidate in the Democratic primary. It would be the candidate that won the primary in the Jaybird Party election. Well, ultimately the courts ruled that that was unconstitutional, so that disappeared. Okay, the Voting Rights Act, one thing that it did was provide for bilingual ballots. So you go to vote and you'll find that the ballots are in English and Spanish and Vietnamese and Chinese. So you can select whichever language you want to vote in and go for it. Okay, and Texas in 2011 passed a voter ID law, which has been controversial because a lot of people don't have easy access to a voter ID. Obviously, if you have a car and you drive it, you have a driver's license, and that's an acceptable ID. But a lot of people don't have a car, they don't have a driver's license because maybe they're young, they can't afford a car. Maybe they're old and they can't drive anymore. Maybe they're disabled and they can't drive, and so they don't have a driver's license. So it tends to suppress the vote of people in those categories. And so it's been controversial. Okay, one group of people who are disqualified from voting are people who have been judged mentally incompetent by a court. Also, somebody who has committed a felony and has not finished their probation or their sentence or what have you. Texas, is good that if you commit a felony, once you complete your sentence, then you can vote again. Some states don't allow that. Some states say once you're convicted of a felony, you can never, ever, ever vote again in this state. About 79% of the state's voting age population is registered to vote. And low turnout elections are those who, most elections are for low visibility offices, like if you're voting for, a county treasurer or something like that, then most people don't care and don't vote. Okay, the factors that are most important in influencing whether or not a person votes is income and education level. People who have a good education, they understand the value of voting, and so they vote. People who have good education also have good money, good income. They tend to go together. That's one reason that you're in this class and other classes and getting an education, because education will help you succeed in life. Okay, in Texas, the legislature is responsible for redistricting, and whichever party controls the legislature controls the redistricting, and redistricting can be done in a very prejudicial way. It's called gerrymandering or gerrymandering, and it's a process by which whoever's drawing up the various voting districts can draw them in such a way as they tend to favor one party over another. They can move just enough party A voters into a district which is held now by a official elected by Party B, but they can move some Party A people in there to flip the district the other way and elect their party member next time there's an election. So that goes on. Redistricting can actually happen at any time, but it normally happens after the census. Census is held every 10 years, and so after the 10-year census, when the figures come in the following year, then the legislature meets and they have to redraw their district lines in Texas, because Texas is large and we have a lot of districts and a lot of members of the House of Representatives in Washington, and in the House of Representatives here in Texas, there's 150 representatives, and each one of them is elected from a single member district. And when population changes, it increases, decreases, people move around, they have to redraw those district lines to account for that. So here again, whatever party is in charge of the legislature is in charge of drawing those lines, and they can do them in a very prejudicial way, and they usually wind up getting challenged in court as being discriminatory against some group, like African Americans or Hispanics or whatever. Okay, if you wanted to devise a method of redistricting that would make races for the Texas legislature more competitive, you would probably want to give the redistricting process to a nonpartisan commission. There are a few states that do that. California, for example, does that. They don't do redistricting in their state legislature. They have a commission, and the commission is nonpartisan or bipartisan or what have you, and they just draw lines according to census districts and natural boundaries like rivers and major highways and so forth, and they don't pay attention to how did this district vote in the last election. So if you wanted to devise a fair and but yet competitive plan for electing state representatives, you would be in favor of appointing a commission to do it rather than letting the legislature do it. Legislature by nature is highly partisan. Okay, when you are an incumbent running for re-election, you have advantages. You have name recognition and visibility. People know you, know your name. Also, it's easy to raise money because you're the incumbent, so you're probably going to win re-election. And people who are interested in what the legislature does, interest groups, they like to have people that favor their position get elected. So they will donate money legally to the campaign of those officials that they like. Okay, and public opinion can play an important role in creating targeted messages during campaigns. So public opinion, all politicians, all candidates run polls. They run them constantly. They pay a lot of money for polling. And based upon the polling, they will target their messages. If people are concerned about a particular issue, they will address that issue. Interest groups use judicial strategies in order to change or challenge existing policies and laws within the court system. So interest groups have been particularly successful, civil rights interest groups. Civil rights groups in defeating the segregated system in the South and even in some other states, filed thousands of lawsuits to challenge segregated laws or discriminatory laws. And they were successful, obviously, because we got civil rights legislation passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and so forth and so on. So they have been very successful in litigation. Environmental groups have met with some success in in litigation also, that if the environment is being endangered and that there's a law that is supposed to protect it from that danger, then they can go to court and sue and get injunctions enjoining some company or some person or some governmental agency enjoining them, which means preventing them from doing whatever it is that threatens the environment. Okay. In the Federalist Papers, after the Constitutional Convention, there were a couple of people who, delegates who sat down and wrote essays. They wrote essays to try to convince the states to ratify the Constitution, because it was required that 9 of the 13 colonies had to ratify the Constitution before it would be effective. And so James Madison was the prominent one along those lines, and he argued in Federalist Paper number 10 that factions would play an important role in American politics. Now, those factions are now political parties. Ultimately, interest groups want policy, governmental policy that favors their group, whatever their group is. If it's the oil and gas industry, they want legislation and regulations that favor the oil and gas industry. If it's an environmental group, they want laws and regulations that protect the environment. Okay, it is very important for an interest group to have an office in Austin. Obviously, they can develop long-term relationships with members of the legislature. Some of the members of the legislature live most of the time in Austin. They're there during all the sessions, and so if your interest group has an office there, they can be, in a way of speaking, next door to the people that they're trying to influence. Okay, that is the conclusion of your exam on Unit 2 for Texas Government, and you can take the exam. You can watch this video, which apparently, obviously, you already have. You can take the exam, and the exam is 50 questions, multiple choice, or true or false, and you must take the exam on your own without outside help. And when you start taking the exam, you have to finish it. You can't take breaks during the exam because it is a timed exam. So you can't stop working. You have to, once you start, you got to finish the exam. Okay, so have a nice rest of the day, and we'll see you in class. Thank you.